Have you ever felt that a decision appeared inside you before you actually decided? Not slowly, not logically, but instantly. A reaction, a preference, a feeling of certainty, arriving before thought itself. Most people believe life unfolds through conscious choice. We imagine ourselves standing at crossroads, analyzing options, deciding rationally, moving forward intentionally. But what if that image is incomplete? What if the moment you believe you are choosing, the decision has already begun somewhere deeper? Pause for a moment. Think about the last important decision you made. Did you truly construct it step by step, or did you first feel the answer, and only afterward create reasons to justify it? This subtle detail changes everything, because neuroscience has discovered something unsettling. Before conscious awareness activates, the brain has already started preparing an action milliseconds earlier, sometimes seconds earlier. Your body moves toward a direction before the narrative of "I decided" appears, which raises a question few people dare to ask. If the brain begins deciding before awareness, who is actually choosing? For centuries, humanity believed consciousness was the leader, the commander, the center of control. But modern research suggests something quieter and far more mysterious. Conscious thought may not be the origin of decisions. It may be the storyteller, the narrator explaining actions after they have already begun. And suddenly, the sense of identity trembles. Because if thoughts arise on their own, if impulses appear if emotions activate before intention, then perhaps the self you call me is not the first cause. Maybe it is the observer arriving late. This realization feels uncomfortable, not because it removes freedom, but because it challenges the illusion of control. You were taught that you shape reality through deliberate effort, that success depends on conscious will, that transformation comes from forcing change. Yet observe your own life carefully. How many times did you promise yourself to act differently, and still repeated the same reaction? How many times did you understand something intellectually, but felt unable to change emotionally? Knowledge appeared, but behavior remained. Because beneath conscious intention, another system operates. Silent, efficient, ancient. A system designed not for truth, but for survival. The brain is not primarily concerned with happiness. It is concerned with prediction, with familiarity, with minimizing uncertainty. And to achieve this, it builds patterns, automatic responses, emotional shortcuts, internal programs running continuously. You do not wake up each morning deciding how to interpret reality. Your perception is already filtered, your expectations already shaped, your emotional reactions already rehearsed. Long before awareness speaks, the mechanism is active, and this does not mean you are powerless. It means something deeper is happening, because if decisions begin before awareness, then awareness itself has a new role. Not commander, not controller, but witness. The observer who notices the process. The space where choice becomes possible. Perhaps true freedom was never about thinking harder. Perhaps it begins the moment you see how thinking happens. And this changes the direction of the entire journey. Because now the question is no longer, how do I control my life? And once this question appears, there is no going back. Something has already begun to awaken. You start noticing reactions forming, thoughts emerging, emotions rising, not as enemies, not as problems, but as processes. And in observing the process, distance appears. A silent gap, a space between impulse and identity. Most people never notice this space. They live inside automatic responses, believing they are authors of everything they experience. But awareness reveals something extraordinary. You are not only the thinker, you are the one who sees thought. You are not only the reaction, you are the field in which reaction appears. And when this recognition begins, life feels different. Not because circumstances change immediately, but because perception shifts. And perception is where reality reorganizes. So now, stay with this question. If your brain begins deciding before you do, who is the one noticing it? Because the answer may redefine what you call yourself. And what comes next goes even deeper. There is something even more unsettling than discovering the brain decides before you do. It is realizing you may have spent your entire life responding to decisions you never saw being formed. Because when observation becomes deeper, something unusual appears. Thoughts arise, emotions arise, impulses arise, and none of them ask permission. You do not choose the next thought. It simply appears. You do not decide which emotion comes first. It happens. Only afterward, the mind creates a story saying, I chose this. Perhaps consciousness is not the beginning of experience. Perhaps it is the explanation that follows. Imagine watching a movie. while believing you were writing the script when the story was already unfolding. This idea reshapes identity itself. For years you were taught to trust your mind completely, to believe thoughts define who you are, that decisions define your essence. But what if thoughts are simply events? Mental events appearing in awareness, just as sounds appear in space, or waves appear in the ocean. You do not create every wave, you observe it. Perhaps thought works the same way. The mind continuously generates content, based on memory, experience, conditioning, emotional learning, and this happens silently, long before conscious awareness. Most brain activity occurs outside consciousness, processing millions of signals per second, comparing past experiences, predicting threats, preparing automatic responses. By the time a thought reaches awareness, its journey has already happened, which leads to a deeper question. If you do not choose the first thought, where does freedom exist? Many assume this discovery removes free will. But perhaps the opposite is true. Freedom may not exist in the first impulse. It may exist in what comes next. In the moment you notice the impulse, that tiny interval, almost invisible, is where something extraordinary appears. Awareness, the brain produces patterns, but awareness can observe them, and observation changes systems. When a pattern is invisible, it governs completely. When it becomes visible, it begins to weaken. You may not choose the first thought, but you can choose not to become trapped by it. This is where the observer emerges. Not the thinker, not the reactor, the observer, the one who notices without merging. And in that moment, a silent transformation begins. Inner space appears, between stimulus and reaction, between emotion and action, between thought and identity. This space is rare, because the brain prefers speed, automation, immediate reaction, but awareness prefers presence, and presence slows the automatic. Perhaps this is why moments of clarity feel different. Time expands, reactivity softens, decisions become conscious, not because total control is achieved, but because automatic reaction loosens. You begin to notice, and noticing changes everything. Quantum physics describes reality as a field of possibilities, potential states awaiting interaction, nothing fully defined, until observation occurs. Interestingly, the brain operates similarly. Before awareness, multiple neural possibilities exist. Multiple responses prepare simultaneously. Conscious observation acts like a collapse point. One experience stabilizes. Perhaps you are not the original creator of decisions, but you are the space where decisions become real. And this completely transforms the meaning of choice. Choice may not be initiating thought. It may be recognizing which thought continues living. What receives attention receives energy. What is observed transforms. What remains unconscious repeats. Now observe your own life. How many reactions were automatic? How many conflicts began before reflection? How many decisions were driven by old emotions? Perhaps life was never only about external choices. Perhaps it has always been about recognizing the inner mechanism. And when the mechanism becomes visible, experience changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but silently, as if something inside awakens, without noise. And now, another question begins to form. If thoughts arise before awareness, and decisions begin before the self notices, what exactly is this self? That question is the doorway to the next level. Because what comes next goes even deeper. There comes a moment when something quietly shifts inside you. Not a dramatic event, not a sudden revelation, just a subtle realization. You begin to notice you may never have been the true author of your story. Look carefully. Throughout the day, thoughts appear without invitation. Ideas emerge, memories return, concerns arise, and almost automatically you assume all of this is you. But there is a profound difference between producing thoughts and noticing thoughts. Most people never recognize this distinction, because from early life we were taught to identify with the mind. A fearful thought appears and you say, I am afraid. A negative thought arises and you say, that's who I am. But perhaps thought is only a passing event, something occurring within awareness, not something defining the observer. Modern neuroscience reveals something fascinating. The brain operates as a predictive system. It does not simply react to reality, it anticipates it, based on everything that happened before. Past experiences, emotional learning, repeated patterns. The brain constantly predicts the next moment to conserve energy, because survival has always mattered more than discovery, which means something profound. Much of what you call decision may actually be prediction. You do not only choose, you recognize patterns. You do not react only to the present, you respond to memory. Perhaps this explains why situations feel strangely familiar, even when they are new. similar relationships, similar challenges, similar emotions, as if life were following an invisible script. Not because reality repeats, but because the brain seeks familiarity. The familiar feels safe, even when it is not healthy. This is where many become trapped. They try to change external circumstances while the internal observer remains conditioned. New environments, new people, new goals, yet the same internal structure travels with them. Experience reorganizes again, not destiny, but neural coherence. The brain prefers confirming existing beliefs, filtering information, selecting perceptions, ignoring novelty, not intentionally, simply efficiently, which raises a difficult question. If the brain constantly predicts, are you truly seeing reality, or only recognizing familiar interpretations? Perhaps you have never perceived the world directly, only interpretations of it, and this changes everything. If perception is constructed, identity may be constructed as well. You are not born with every belief you carry. You learned them. You were not born with every fear. You conditioned them. You were not born reacting automatically. You trained your brain unconsciously, and what was learned can be observed. What can be observed can begin to change. Real transformation does not begin with force. It begins with awareness. When you notice a thought arise without instantly believing it, something extraordinary happens. Distance appears, and inside that distance, freedom emerges. Freedom may never have meant choosing anything. Perhaps freedom means noticing before reacting. Automatic reaction belongs to the past. Awareness belongs to the present. And only the present contains possibility. Quantum physics describes particles existing as probabilities, multiple potential states coexisting, until observation occurs. Similarly, the brain holds multiple possible responses. When awareness observes, one becomes experience, which means something powerful. You may not choose the first impulse, but you influence which reality continues. Attention is direction. Where attention rests, experience organizes itself. Perhaps life has never been shaped only by events, but by what repeatedly received attention. Observed fears grow stronger. Observed possibilities become real, and slowly you begin to notice something surprising. The mind continues functioning. Thoughts continue appearing, but you are no longer completely inside them. There is space, there is silence, there is presence, and for the first time, the observer begins to awaken, not as an idea, but as lived experience. And when this happens, another inevitable question appears. If you are not your thoughts, who is observing all of this? That question takes us even deeper. There is something uncomfortable when we begin observing the mind itself, because for the first time we realize we may not be directing everything. For years you believed your choices were born in the present moment. You decided to speak, decided to react, decided to trust, decided to walk away. But neuroscience has begun revealing something silent, almost unsettling. Before you feel you made a decision, your brain has already started the process. Before the thought appears, the impulse already exists. Before I want, the system is already moving. And this changes how identity itself is understood. If decisions begin before awareness, then awareness is not the beginning, it is the witness. Perhaps you never noticed this. The exact moment an emotion appears, the instant something inside reacts before explanation exists. Someone says something, and immediately there is defense, irritation, the need to prove something. Only afterward, the mind builds a rational story, as if explaining something that already happened. Most people live inside this invisible delay. Reaction comes first, explanation comes later, and the illusion is born. I chose. But perhaps you only became aware of the choice after it began. This does not remove freedom, it relocates it. Freedom may not exist at the start of decision, but in the space that follows, there is a nearly imperceptible interval between impulse and action. A silent gap, small, subtle, almost invisible. And there, something extraordinary happens, because within that space you can observe. An observation changes everything. Automatic reaction weakens, the program slows, the pattern hesitates, not because you fought it, but because it was seen. Awareness does not interrupt through force. Awareness interrupts through presence. Perhaps this is why so many people feel life running on autopilot. Days repeat, conversations echo, relationships follow familiar scripts. Emotions feel known even when circumstances change. Because the brain seeks efficiency, it builds shortcuts, pre-constructed responses, automated behavior. Biologically, this is brilliant. Existentially, it can become imprisonment. Efficiency is not always freedom. Sometimes, it is sophisticated repetition. Imagine believing you are choosing while actually repeating old patterns. responding the same way, avoiding the same risks, seeking the same validation, fearing the same loss, and calling this personality. Perhaps personality is memory in motion, emotional memory, behavioral memory, invisible memory operating in the present. And when you begin seeing this, something profound happens. You stop identifying completely with thought. You begin observing thought. And that shift is enormous, because the observer is not the program. The observer is what can see the program. And here we enter something deeper still. If the brain initiates decisions before awareness, who observes the brain? Who notices thought arising? Who recognizes impulse? There seems to be a layer beyond operational mind. A silent presence, effortless, non-reactive, simply aware. Perhaps it has always been there, but mental noise was too loud to notice, and when awareness touches this presence, identity transforms. You stop being only the reactor, and begin becoming the observer. Awakening may not be about acquiring new answers. It may be about seeing the old mechanism. Not destroying the system, but watching it operate, because what is clearly seen cannot control in the same way. Slowly, without struggle, without force, something reorganizes. Choice stops being automatic. Reaction stops being inevitable. Consciousness begins participating. And this may be the true beginning of freedom, not controlling everything, but no longer being unconsciously controlled. And now a deeper question emerges. If the brain begins decisions before you know, then who observes the moment of knowing? There may be something within you always one step beyond thought, something that does not react, something that simply knows, and perhaps, in the next moment we move closer to that discovery, because understanding how the brain decides is only half the journey. True transformation begins when you recognize who is looking from behind the mind. Perhaps the greatest discovery is not realizing that the brain decides before you. Perhaps the real discovery is recognizing how much of your life was spent defending something that was never truly you. From early life, an identity began forming, not consciously, but through experiences, reactions, silent adaptations, every moment of praise, every experience of rejection, every time you needed protection, every attempt to belong. The brain recorded everything, and slowly, it built a version of you. A functional version, a safe version, a predictable version, but perhaps not a free one. Think for a moment. How many decisions you believe are yours were simply learned responses. Respond quickly to avoid conflict. Agree to maintain connection, withdraw before rejection happens. Prove value to feel accepted. Avoid risk to avoid pain. The brain does not create identity based on truth. It creates identity based on survival, and survival seeks stability, even when stability limits growth, even when it maintains repeating cycles. Even when it prevents deep transformation, because uncertainty to the brain means threat. And something fascinating happens. You begin defending old patterns as if defending who you are, but perhaps you are only defending who you learned to become. There is a silent difference between identity and conditioning. Identity feels personal, conditioning feels natural. The brain merges both. Habits become personality, memories become destiny, reactions become character, and one of the most powerful illusions emerges. The feeling of a permanent self. But observe carefully. You do not think exactly as you once did. You do not feel the same way. You do not react the same way. Parts of you have changed many times. So who is this fixed self you protect? Perhaps it never existed as something solid. Perhaps it is a continuously updated story. And here something liberating appears. If identity was constructed, it can also be observed. And whatever can be observed, cannot be the observer. This is a decisive realization. The moment you notice a thought, something in you is not the thought. When you recognize an emotion, something in you is not the emotion. When fear is seen, something in you is not fear. There is a silent presence prior to reaction, prior to programming, prior to automatic decision. And perhaps, this presence is closer to what you truly are than any story you ever told about yourself. Imagine living without constantly defending an identity, without proving, without automatic reactions, without repeating patterns simply because they feel familiar. This does not mean abandoning who you are. It means discovering what remains when automation slows down. And when this begins, life changes in subtle ways. Situations remain, challenges remain, emotions still arise, but internally, space appears, choice appears, presence emerges. And within that space, the brain stops being an automatic pilot. It becomes a tool, not the commander. Perhaps freedom was never doing anything you want. Perhaps freedom is noticing when something inside tries to decide before you. and choosing to observe, choosing to breathe, choosing not to react immediately. That small interval changes entire destinies. Patterns survive through unconscious repetition, but they dissolve when clearly seen, without judgment, without struggle, only awareness. Maybe this is why people search for external change, new places, new goals, new identities, without realizing true transformation begins when you notice. This is automatic, and once automation is seen, something new is born, not a new personality, but a new relationship with the mind itself, and that relationship is awakening. Perhaps now, a different feeling is arising within you, a subtle distance between you and your thoughts, as if you were observing what once felt like yourself. If this is happening, it is not coincidence, it is awareness emerging, and when awareness emerges, old control weakens, because the brain may initiate decisions, but consciousness can redefine their meaning, and this brings us deeper still. If many thoughts did not begin with you, if many decisions started before awareness, then maybe the question is no longer, how do I control the mind? But instead, who are you when you no longer automatically obey it? That question leads us toward the deepest moment of this video, because next, we approach the final threshold, between mind and consciousness. There is a moment, almost invisible, when the way you understand yourself begins to change. Not an external event, not something happening in the world, something shifting inside perception itself, a subtle displacement, as if you were no longer completely inside experience but beginning to watch it unfold. For most of your life, you were taught that you think before acting, that you decide before choosing, that control comes before reaction. But what happens when you discover that much of what you call decisions started before you even noticed? Neuroscience revealed something unsettling. The brain initiates decisions before conscious awareness recognizes intention. Before I want, before I choose, before verbal thought, as if something inside you is always ahead, and this realization can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the deepest belief we carry, control. If the brain decides first, where is freedom? If thoughts appear by themselves, who is thinking? If impulses arise uninvited, who is choosing? Perhaps the real question was never, do I control my mind? Perhaps it is, who notices the mind? Watch carefully. A thought appears. You did not consciously create it, it simply emerges. A memory, a worry, an image, an emotion, none of these ask permission. None wait for authorization. And yet, something notices, something observes, something recognizes. There is a silent presence prior to reaction, prior to interpretation. Prior to interpretation. And perhaps, this is the essential discovery. You do not need to produce thoughts to exist. You do not need to control emotions to be aware. You do not need to stop the mind to awaken. Awakening is not stopping the process. It is no longer confusing yourself with it. Imagine watching a film. For hours you forget you are watching. You feel everything, fear, joy, attachment. Then suddenly you remember it's just a movie. Nothing on screen changed. The story continues. The emotions remain. But your relationship shifts. You are still watching, but no longer lost inside it. Perhaps the mind works the same way. Thoughts continue, reactions appear. The brain anticipates decisions. But something in you begins watching instead of merely reacting, and this small shift is enormous. Because when you observe an impulse before acting, a new possibility appears. A pause, a silent gap. And inside that gap, automatic patterns weaken. Old repetitions slow down. Stories stop feeling inevitable, not because the brain instantly changed, but because awareness entered the process. Perhaps freedom was never doing whatever you want. Perhaps freedom is seeing the mechanism operate, recognizing patterns as they arise, seeing fear before escape, seeing habit before repetition, seeing thought before identification. And when that happens, something deeply human emerges, conscious participation, not heavy responsibility. Living responsibility, the ability to participate in experience itself. For the first time, you are not merely being carried, you are present. There is unexpected peace in this recognition. You realize you do not need to fight the mind. It is not your enemy. It is an ancient system, designed to predict danger, avoid pain, seek safety. The brain does not aim for awakening, it aims for survival. And so it repeats patterns, chooses familiar paths, recreates known emotions. Even when limiting, even when exhausting, even when outdated. But awareness does not destroy the program. It illuminates it. And what is illuminated can no longer remain fully unconscious. Perhaps that is why moments of clarity feel quiet. Nothing dramatic happens, yet something reorganizes internally. You react less, observe more, listen deeper, pause before responding, and slowly reality begins to feel different. Not because the world changed, but because the observer stopped operating on autopilot. And now notice something curious. As you listen, thoughts continue appearing, judgments, doubts, memories, agreement, and still, something is aware of all of this. Something that is not the thought, not the emotion, not the impulse, only awareness. Who is that? Who is listening? Who is present now? Perhaps this is the deepest question one can ask. Because when you begin investigating it, the identity built solely on the mind starts dissolving, and within that space, a new way of living emerges. Less automatic, more conscious, less reactive, more present. Perhaps awakening was never about absolute control. Perhaps it is realizing you were never only the thought, never only the decision, never only the program. You were always the one capable of noticing it. And if that is true, something extraordinary becomes clear. Even if the brain decides first, awareness can awaken afterward, and that awakening changes everything. Because now a final question appears. If the brain initiates, but you can observe, then what are you really? That is the doorway opening now. The final doorway of this video. If you made it this far, something inside you may no longer feel the same, not because you received a final answer, but because you began noticing what was always there. For most of life, we believe we are our thoughts, our reactions, our emotions, our decisions. But now, perhaps you are starting to see something different. Thoughts appear, yet you observe them. Emotions arise, yet you are not limited to them. Impulses emerge, yet there is a space before action, and inside that space, something extraordinary happens. For the first time, you recognize you are not merely the brain's outcome, you are the awareness capable of witnessing the process. And this realization quietly transforms existence itself. Because when you stop identifying with every thought, the mind loses its authority to define you. When you stop automatically believing every emotion, the past begins losing control. When you notice impulse before reaction, the future stops repeating automatically. Perhaps freedom was never controlled. Perhaps freedom is recognizing the moment automation begins, and simply being present, not fighting, not suppressing, just seeing, and seeing, already transforms. What becomes conscious can no longer remain fully unconscious. Think for a moment. How many decisions in your life happened without awareness? How many paths were chosen by fear? How many reactions came from old conditioning? How many identities were simply continuations of invisible programs? And yet, something inside you was always watching. A silent presence, never conditioned, never programmed, existing before memory, before identity, before narrative. Perhaps this is what you are recognizing now. Not a new idea, but a return to what has always been here, observing, waiting, silently aware. As this realization deepens, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing meaning. Meaning begins appearing. You stop forcing change. Change begins unfolding naturally. You stop trying to control reality. You change your relationship with it. And when the relationship changes, experience changes. Not because the world obeys, but because the observer awakens. Perhaps humanity's greatest misunderstanding was believing consciousness equals thought. But consciousness is the space where thought appears. Perhaps you were never the voice in the mind. Perhaps you are always the one listening. And if that is true, something profound becomes clear. Even if the brain begins decisions first, awareness still recognizes what follows. And in that recognition, true choice emerges. Not choosing the thought, but choosing not to be ruled by it. Now consider this. If the brain anticipates decisions, if patterns shape behavior, if invisible programs influence experience, then a deeper question arises. If you are not merely thought, not merely brain, not merely programming, what are you? This question does not need an answer, only presence, because the next step of this journey begins exactly here, at the realization that awareness may extend beyond the individual mind, a field, a silent intelligence, an invisible connection between perception and reality. And that is exactly what we explore next. The quantum field is listening to you, because perhaps you are not the only one observing reality. Perhaps reality is responding to how you observe it. If this reflection resonated with you, write one single word in the comments. The word that represents your current state. Awareness, presence, clarity, silence, awakening. Do not overthink, just write it, and notice how it feels. If you want to continue this journey, subscribe to the channel. This space exists for those ready to look beyond the automatic mind, and instead of searching randomly, continue through the playlist. Each episode reveals another hidden layer of consciousness. Grateful to have you here. Much light on your path. And when you are ready, the next step is already waiting.